Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Christian Smith. On this channel, we look at how the word is made practical. And finally, today we are diving into the book of Daniel. We're looking at chapter 1. It shows how they were imprisoned yet immovable as their belief, their faith in God came before anything and everything. So we're going to look at how that was a reality for them and how it can be true for us too. So let's dive in. All right, so as we dive into this chapter, I just want to give a note about the videos themselves. We're starting this series, so we're gonna go chapter by chapter. Each video is going to cover one chapter, and we are going to break these videos up into 3 different sections. First, we're gonna look at the narrative, kind of the story, what's taking place here in the studio. Then we're gonna go to the workshop and the drawing board to look at some of the structure. This is particularly important when we look at the prophecies so we can visually see what's happening. Then we're just going to take some time to apply it to our lives. There are so many practical lessons that we can take from this and apply to our day-to-day experience. So that's going to be the breakdown of the videos, and today we are looking at chapter 1. So let's dive in. Now, as we're looking at this chapter, let's just read the first couple verses so we can see how this narrative begins. In verse 1, it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar at the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God." A couple things to note in these first verses is we have 2 kingdoms we're looking at. You have the world-ruling pagan kingdom of Babylon, and you have Jerusalem that's besieged by Babylon. Unfortunately, Jerusalem was to represent God. It was to be God's people, to reflect who he is. But at this time, they were going against God in so many ways, he wasn't really able to protect them. They weren't allowing him to guide them in any way. So as a result, Babylon takes them captive. Also, as they do this, they take the vessels from the sanctuary, or God's temple, and they put them into the temples of their pagan gods as a result. So as Babylon does this, the king also notes to set aside certain people. We see that in verse 3. "Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel, some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand." So King Nebuchadnezzar asks to have some of the children of the nobles, or the descendants of the king, to be set aside to learn the language of Babylon and to work in the palace for the king. Verse 6 tells us who some of those individuals were. It says this, "Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abed-Nego." So we see that some of those children, some of those youth, were Daniel and his friends. Now, you notice here we have a name change. It's because Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, their names reflected God. But as they're brought into Babylon, they want to change that. The Babylonians want to change their names to names that reflect their pagan gods. So Daniel and his friends, basically they're arrested, they're ripped from their homes, they're put into this training within Babylon, and their identities are changed. It's a really rough situation to be in as one of them, and at that, they're very young when this is all taking place. Now at this point, the narrative changes a little bit, because a part of their training is to be in school for 3 years and to take part in the king's food and drink. Now at first that sounds great, right? Like the food from the king would be the best of all. But we see that Daniel refuses. It becomes a moral issue for him. And let's just read it from the text. In verse 8, it says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So why does Daniel use the word that he doesn't want to defile himself? Well, the king's food would have done just that. It would have been full of unclean meats, which is something they wouldn't eat. All of the food would have been dedicated to idols and been a part of worship services, which he wouldn't want to be a part of. And the alcohol is also something that they would not drink. And so he comes before the chief of the eunuchs saying, I don't want to defile myself. Give me something else to eat. But the chief isn't worried about this. He's actually worried for his life. We see this in verse 10, where it says this. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So as you see, the chief of the eunuchs is worried for his life, because he's set over preparing them to be fit for service. And if they are shown to be unhealthy, the king is not going to be happy, and the guy's going to lose his head. You would think that at this point maybe Daniel would just go along with things, but that's not what happens. Let's see what verse 12 says. It says, Please test your servants for 10 days. Let them give us vegetables to eat, water to drink. Let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies. And as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So he consented with them in the matter and tested them for 10 days. So Daniel says, look, there's all these delicacies that we can have, but simply give us vegetables and water. And that might sound crazy, but the results are truly amazing as to what happens. Daniel stands firm in his belief. He's not going to take of the unclean foods. He's not going to take of the foods dedicated to idols. He's not going to take in the alcohol. He simply asks for vegetables and water. He puts God first in this situation that is quite trying. I mean, think about it. Daniel, his friends, they are taken captive. They're basically in prison. They're put in these challenging, difficult situations. But we start to see in chapter 1, and this is repeated throughout the entire book, that Daniel and his friends put God first, and God honors them. So what happens? Let's look at verse 15 and see what is the result of the test. It says, At the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of the delicacies and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. So it's so interesting. After this 10-day period, they're shown to be stronger and wiser. And so the chief says, look, we're just going to do this for everyone then. And at the end of this chapter, the king notices the same thing. Verse 19, the king interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. So as we see, Daniel and his friends continued to grow in wisdom. But one of the really important things that I think we should take from this chapter is how Daniel was willing to stand up for what he believed in a really difficult situation. You may ask, how is it that you can do the same thing? We find ourselves in challenging situations all the time, whether it's family that may have different beliefs, or friends or coworkers, or whatever the case, whatever the situation. How is it that we can be able to stand up for what's important and what we believe in challenging circumstances? Well, there's one particular verse, in fact, one particular word in this chapter that unlocks the key of how Daniel could stand strong even at a very young age. So to break that word down a little bit more, we're actually going to transition over to the workshop. So as we're here in the workshop, it's true that there's no prophecies in Daniel chapter 1, but I want to direct our minds to this one verse, in verse 8. It says, But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies. This verse is why Daniel was able to be unmoved in what he believed, why he was able to stand up for what was right, even in difficult circumstances. It was this word sim, which means to place, to fix, to set, to resolve, to determine. Daniel determined in his heart not to defile himself. That is the reason he was able to stand in such a difficult time.
Alright, so what are some of the practical lessons we can take? The main one I would say is that Daniel made his decision before he was ever in a difficult circumstance or situation. He purposed in his heart not to defile himself. We can do the same thing. We can be sure we can make our choices, our decisions before we're ever in a difficult circumstance so that we can stand. Daniel relied on God, and we should do the same thing as well. Secondly, Daniel didn't just, freak out on everyone who wasn't living like he was. He just lived it. He just represented God, and that was a huge witness to everyone around him. And so those are the ways we can practically adapt Daniel chapter 1 in our own day-to-day experience. Alright guys, well that was Daniel chapter 1. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification to get ready for Daniel chapter 2. It's an amazing chapter. We start to dive into Bible prophecy, and you don't want to miss it. On another note, if you're curious about how to live more healthfully, my wife is working with dietetics and nutrition. She has her own channel. I'll link that below, and we will see you in the next video. See ya!